The wind crawled across the plains like a living thing, cold and sharp, dragging dust over the dead grass. The storm hadn't yet broken, but the sky was the color of gunmetal and smelled of rain and iron. A lone rider moved through that endless gray, his hat low, his coat heavy with trail dust. He wasn't in a hurry. Men who'd lived long enough to see too much never were. The horse beneath him snorted, weary, as if it too carried the weight of something unspoken. He used to be known by a name that made men flinch, but now it was a name he never said. Folks in nearby towns called him the man who walks away. They didn't know from what. He'd come west to forget, or to hide, though he couldn't say from which sin. The Colt revolver wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of his saddlebag was a promise he kept to himself, that he'd never draw again, not unless the world gave him no choice. He saw the fence before he saw her. Half the posts had fallen, barbed wire hanging like torn veins. Beyond it stood a small ranch house with a single lantern flickering in the wind. Then he heard the sound, wood cracking, someone crying out. He dismounted, boots sinking into the wet soil, and found her near the far gate, bent low, one hand gripping her belly. The woman was young, though exhaustion had stolen any trace of softness from her face. Rain slicked her black hair against her cheeks, and when she looked up, he saw eyes that burned through the storm, desperate, proud, afraid to ask for help. She was trying to hammer the post upright, one trembling hand holding the nail. He took the hammer from her without asking, his other hand steadying the wood. She stared, breathing hard as thunder rolled overhead. He worked silently, each strike precise, the rhythm of a man who knew how to build and destroy in equal measure. When he finished, the wind carried her whisper, "Thank you." Her accent wrapped around the words like silk and stone. He tipped his hat and looked toward the distant hills, where lightning revealed a burned symbol on another fence post, a jagged red mark shaped like a claw. She saw his eyes catch it. "They did that after he died," she said quietly. "My husband. They said he shouldn't have owned land here." He didn't answer. The rain came harder, soaking them both. He helped her to the porch, his hand briefly on her arm, a rough, callous touch that somehow felt gentle. Inside, the house smelled of boiled rice, hay, and loneliness. The floorboards creaked under his boots. He saw a half-carved crib, a child's blanket folded neatly beside it, untouched. She lit another lamp, and for a moment the storm outside was only a whisper against the windows. "I don't need help," she said, though her voice trembled. "I didn't ask if you did," he replied. He removed his hat, shook off the water, and glanced around the room. Everything she owned looked like it was fighting to survive, like her. Her name was Lynn. She'd come west with her husband 5 years earlier, chasing gold and land. What she got instead was a patch of dirt and a grave. He didn't ask how she survived. The answer was in the cracks on her hands and the steadiness in her eyes. She moved with the quiet of someone who'd been taught to endure. When he rose to leave, she stopped him. "You shouldn't come here. The men who marked my fence. They don't forget." He met her gaze. "Neither do I." Then he stepped out into the rain again. By morning, the storm had passed, but the land still smelled of lightning. He was back by the fence, driving new posts into the earth. Lynn watched from the porch, one hand on her belly, unsure whether to be grateful or afraid. The sound of hammering echoed across the empty valley, solid, defiant. When the last post was fixed, he leaned on his shovel and looked at the horizon. The wind carried the smell of smoke. He squinted, saw a group of riders in the far distance, small, moving slow, watching. He said nothing, just turned back to his work. Later, she brought him tea in a chipped porcelain cup. He took it without ceremony, drank it standing. It was bitter and warm, cut with jasmine. "You don't talk much," she said. "Talk's cheap out here," he replied. His voice was low, the kind that had said last words over too many bodies. He noticed the worn scar around her wrist, a rope mark, old and faint. She noticed his too on his left hand where a bullet had grazed him long ago. 2 ghosts pretending to be people. That night he built a small fire outside her porch. He stayed there silent, watching the dark plains. Coyotes cried somewhere beyond the ridge. The stars came out clean and cold. Lynn's lantern flickered behind the window, her shadow moving softly inside. For a moment he thought he heard her humming, a tune without words, something half forgotten. When dawn came, the world was pale and still. He found something nailed to her barn, a piece of paper torn wet with dew. 4 words scrawled in red paint. Get out, foreign witch. He tore it down and tossed it into the fire. When Lynn came out, he didn't tell her what it said. He just nodded toward the fields. Fence still needs fixing. She looked at him for a long time, eyes heavy with the kind of gratitude that carried its own grief. Why are you helping me? He thought about lying, about saying he needed work or coin. Instead, he said, because something needs to stand in this place. The day stretched long. He mended boards, tightened wire, and when his hands bled, she wrapped them with a strip of cloth torn from her own sleeve. Their eyes met only once, and in that brief silence, something unspoken settled between them, something neither dared to name. That evening, as the sun bled red behind the hills, he sat alone by the fence he'd rebuilt. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying voices of men who still believed the West belonged to them. He felt it in his bones, the trouble wasn't done. But for now the posts stood firm, the wire held, and the light from her window glowed steady through the dusk. He didn't know why he cared, only that he did. The storm inside him was quieter now, and somewhere behind him in that small wooden house the widow hummed again, a fragile sound against a world that kept breaking. By the time the snows began to melt, the fence had held through every storm, and so had he. The widow's land looked less like a graveyard now, more like a place trying to live again. He came each morning without invitation, repairing whatever time and neglect had eaten away. Lynn never asked why he stayed. She only boiled tea, left it on the porch, and went about her chores. Between them hung a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of things neither dared to name. He'd started to learn her rhythm. She rose before dawn, her hands in the soil before the light touched the hills. She spoke to the crops in a language he didn't know, soft syllables that made the morning gentler. When she laughed, it came suddenly like sunlight breaking through cloud. And sometimes when her strength failed her and she leaned against the fence, he'd catch her, steady as oak. Then she'd mutter an apology, cheeks burning, and walk away before gratitude could make her weak. The town didn't forget her foreign face. Every time he rode in for nails or feed, men stared longer than they should, their smirks saying what they didn't dare aloud. He ignored them. But one morning on his way back, he saw a fresh red mark burned into a fence post, a clawed circle, same as before. The smell of scorched wood hung thick. It wasn't meant as a warning. It was a promise. That night he found her standing in the field, lantern in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. They're close again, she said. Her voice didn't tremble, though her fingers did. I know, he answered. He didn't tell her about the hoof prints near the creek or the boot prints by the barn. You should not stay here, she said. They will come for me. And you... I've been come for before, he said, looking past her at the hills. Never stopped me fixing what's broke. Something in the way he said it made her stop arguing. The wind rustled the dry grass around them, carrying the faint smell of rain. He returned to the fire pit, added another log, and she stood watching the sparks drift into the night. Days passed with a nervous stillness. He fortified the fence, set new posts with careful precision, tied the gate with heavy rope. He worked with the patience of a man who knew danger by smell alone. Lynn watched him from the porch, one hand resting on her stomach, the other shading her eyes. When she tried to thank him, he only shrugged. Fence don't fix itself, he'd say. When the sun fell, they shared quiet routines. He cleaned his tools. She mended clothes. Some evenings, she'd hum while cooking, a tune that reminded him of rivers and faraway cities he'd never see. He didn't ask what the words meant. He just listened, the melody crawling into the empty corners of his heart. One night, lightning flashed across the plains, painting the world white for a heartbeat. The wind rose hard and fast, carrying the echo of horses. The dogs barked, then whined. He moved without sound, rifle in hand, eyes narrowing through the dark. Shapes flickered beyond the fence, 4, maybe 5 riders. A bottle shattered against the gate, fire blooming briefly before the rain snuffed it out. Laughter followed, wild and cruel. Stay inside, he said, voice low. Lynn clutched her lantern, frozen at the doorway. He stepped into the rain, lifted the rifle, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound cracked like thunder. The riders turned their horses and vanished into the black. The silence afterward felt heavier than gunfire. When he came back in, she stood trembling. "They'll kill you for this," she whispered. "They'll have to ride through that fence first." Her eyes softened, but fear lingered behind them. She took his bleeding hand, splintered from the rifle stock and wrapped it with cloth torn from her sleeve. Her fingers brushed his wrist. His pulse thudded under her touch. Neither spoke. The air between them carried all the words they couldn't say. The next morning, the sheriff's son rode up with 2 men. They wore the same smug grin that always came before trouble. "Nice work you did here," the sheriff's boy said, looking at the repaired posts. "But some fences weren't meant to stand." The gunslinger said nothing. The man leaned from his horse to spat in the dirt and added, "Ain't good business fixing things that don't belong." "She paid for the land," the gunslinger said quietly. "Paper don't change blood," the man sneered. Then he tipped his hat toward Lynn. "Better think about selling. Be a shame if this place went up in smoke one night." Lynn's hand gripped the edge of her shawl, knuckles white. The riders turned their horses and left a trail of laughter behind them. The wind carried it until it sounded like ghosts. That evening she tried to keep busy, chopping herbs, cleaning the porch. But her hands shook too much to hold anything steady. When he came by, she said, "You cannot fight them all." He looked at the horizon where the sun bled into the mountains. "Don't need to. Just gotta make 'em think I might." "You could leave," she said softly. "I tried that once. Didn't take. The night came cold." He sat by the fire outside, her window glowing behind him. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The sound reminded him of nights long ago when he'd waited for men who never came home. Lynn stepped out with a blanket, draped it around his shoulders without a word. Her hand lingered there, just long enough for him to feel its warmth. When she went back inside, he stayed awake until dawn, eyes fixed on the fence line. He counted the stars like bullets. Knowing one of them might mark the hour everything fell apart. By morning, the land was still. The air smelled clean, washed new by the rain. Lynn brought him tea again and he drank it quietly, letting the steam hide his thoughts. He noticed the red mark had been scratched off the gate during the night. Someone had come close enough to change their mind. He didn't tell her. There was no need. The fear in her eyes had already softened into something else. Trust, maybe. Or surrender. Whatever it was, it made him stay a little longer than he meant to. That evening, as dusk spread across the plains, he saw her lighting the lantern by the window. The glow fell across her face, serene but wary, like someone who'd learned to live with the shadow of danger. He stood by the fence, watching the horizon darken, and for the first time in years he felt a reason to stay that wasn't born of guilt. But as the last light faded, he saw movement in the far distance, riders again, silhouettes against the dying sun. He knew they'd be back, and this time they wouldn't just laugh. The days turned brittle with cold, the kind that seeped into the bones and made the earth crack underfoot. The widow's house stood against the wind like a lone survivor of some forgotten war. The gunslinger had fixed every hinge, every board, every nail that could come loose, yet something deeper felt ready to break. The riders hadn't returned, not yet. But their silence was worse than their noise. It meant they were planning. And he knew from experience that planning men were deadlier than reckless ones. He spent his mornings walking the fence line, checking the posts as if they were sentries. Each creak of wood, each whisper of wire was a message. Lynn watched him from the porch, her belly grown heavy now, her breath slower, her steps cautious. The life inside her seemed both fragile and defiant. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she would rest her palm there and whisper something in her language, as if promising the child that the world could still be kind. He found a letter wedged under a loose board by the barn. The paper was rough, smeared with mud, the words scrawled in a hand too careless for mercy. "He dies for you next." He didn't show it to her. He burned it in the forge, the smoke curling into the gray sky like a secret confession. But that night, she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the horizon. "You read something," she said quietly. "You always look that way when you've read bad words." He met her gaze. "Ain't worth you knowing," he said. "Just ghosts stirring dust." Her expression was unreadable. "Ghosts don't ride horses." He had no answer to that. He turned back to his work, hammering boards harder than needed, each strike echoing like the sound of a distant gunshot. The next few days were uneasy. The sheriff's son was seen in town with new men, faces from across the state line, rough, hungry. The air thickened with rumor. When the gunslinger rode in for supplies, conversations fell quiet. A man spat near his boots and said, "Ought to let nature take its course. Some folks don't belong west of the river." He didn't respond. He just looked at the man long enough for him to wish he hadn't spoken. When he returned, Lynn was waiting by the gate. Her eyes told him she already knew. "They'll come again," she said. "Yeah," he replied. "But they'll find me home this time." That night she cooked rice with wild onions and laid 2 bowls on the table. He sat opposite her, steam rising between them. She said, "You fix everything broken but yourself." He chewed slowly, eyes on the flickering lamp. "Some things are meant to stay broke," her voice softened. "Then why help me?" He hesitated. "Because you keep trying when the world tells you not to." They ate in silence after that. When the wind rattled the shutters, she flinched, and he noticed her hand shake just enough for the spoon to tremble. Without thinking, he reached across and steadied it. The touch lasted only a moment, but it changed something. It was as if both had been reminded that the other was real. The next morning, she was gone. The chair she used to sit in was empty, her shawl missing from the hook. He called her name once, then again, louder. The house answered with only the creak of the roof. On the table, a folded letter waited beside the small wooden horse he had carved for her unborn child. The paper was damp with tears, the ink smudged but still legible. "You have given more kindness than this world deserves," it began, "but if I stay, they will kill you. I could not carry that weight. I will go east, to the river towns. Perhaps my child will see another spring there. You fixed my fence, and in doing so, you fixed something in me too. Do not follow. You have already done enough." He stood there a long time, the words burning into him. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain again. He reached for the cloth-wrapped revolver, untouched since the day he buried it under his saddlebag. His hands shook, not from fear, but from remembering how easy it used to be. When he pulled back the hammer, the sound was like an old song finding its way home. He followed the wagon tracks down the valley, past the dry creek and through the narrow pass where the earth turned to red dust. The trail grew rougher as he went, cut deep by recent wheels. He found broken branches, footprints, and then a torn piece of her shawl caught on a sage bush. His stomach sank. He dismounted and touched the fabric. It was stained with blood, faint but fresh. The tracks led north toward the ridge. He knew what kind of men rode that way. The sheriff's son and his gang liked the canyon country. No law out there, just rocks and vultures. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and thunder rolled low like something ancient waking. He pressed forward, rain starting to fall, each drop a drumbeat on his coat. He found the wagon overturned near a cluster of stones, one wheel shattered. The horse lay nearby, throat cut clean. The ground was churned with boot prints. He knelt, fingers tracing the dirt, reading it like scripture. There were signs of struggle, drag marks, the faint imprint of a woman's hand. His jaw tightened. The sound he made was barely human, a mix of grief and fury ground into silence. He stood, loaded the revolver, and adjusted his hat against the rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the distant cliffs where smoke curled faintly. He could hear voices carried by the storm, rough laughter too far to shoot, close enough to promise blood. The storm thickened, washing color from the world until everything turned to silver and shadow. He rode through it like a ghost reborn, the horse's hooves drumming through mud and thunder. His coat snapped behind him, his face set like carved stone. Each mile brought him closer to the sound of those voices, to the campfire he knew would be waiting. He thought of the letter again, the softness of her handwriting, the way she'd called him kind. The word didn't fit him. It never had. But maybe it could fit the man he was trying to be. He glanced at the carved wooden horse still in his pocket and gripped it once, as if holding onto the last piece of something worth saving. The rain fell harder, blurring the world into streaks of fire and darkness. He could see faint movement ahead now, orange light flickering through the trees. The wind carried laughter again, cruel and careless. He spurred his horse forward, heart pounding steady as a war drum. Behind him, the plain stretched silent and empty. Ahead, there was fire, and somewhere within it, the only person who had ever made him forget his own damnation. The storm swallowed his silhouette as he rode on, thunder answering every beat of his heart. The rain had turned the canyon to a maze of mud and shadow. Lightning clawed at the sky, lighting the rocks in brief, violent flashes. The gunslinger guided his horse through the storm, head low, every muscle drawn tight. Each gust of wind carried the distant echoes of laughter, fading and returning like a taunt. He'd known men like them his whole life. wolves that mistook cruelty for strength. But this time it wasn't bounty or revenge that drove him. It was something rarer, something almost holy. He was riding to save the only light he'd found in years of darkness. When the ridge came into view, he dismounted and tied the reins to a thorn tree. Below, a campfire glowed weakly through the downpour. 6 men huddled under a makeshift canopy of hides, their horses restless nearby. He counted the shapes, measured the angles, noted the way they sat, careless, overconfident, half-drunk. Then he saw her. Lynn was bound near the fire, soaked to the skin, her head bowed. She was still breathing. That was all he needed to see. He drew the revolver and ran his thumb along the barrel, feeling the nicks and scratches that told the story of his past sins. He checked the cylinder, 6 bullets, each one clean and dry. He'd always believed hell waited for him, but tonight he decided to walk into it on his own terms. The first shot tore through the rain like a curse. The man keeping watch dropped without a sound, his body folding into the mud. The others scrambled, shouting, reaching for their guns, but the storm swallowed their words. The gunslinger moved from rock to rock, reloading by instinct, each movement precise and practiced. Thunder covered the sound of his boots. Another flash of lightning, another shot. The second man fell backward into the fire, sending sparks flying like angry spirits. The sheriff's son emerged from the tent, face pale and eyes wide. "You should have stayed dead, old man," he yelled, fumbling for his rifle. The gunslinger didn't answer. He fired once more, the shot catching the young man in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. 2 men remained. They charged through the rain, firing wildly. 1 bullet grazed his arm, another clipped his hat. He dropped to one knee, steadying his breath, and took them both down with 2 clean shots. When the echo faded, only the storm spoke. He walked toward the fire. Lynn's eyes opened as he knelt beside her, her face streaked with mud and blood. "I told you not to come," she whispered, voice trembling. "Yeah," he said quietly, cutting the ropes. "I've never been good at doing what I'm told." She tried to stand, but her leg gave out. He caught her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Her hand found his shoulder and stayed there. "They wanted to take me east," she said weakly. "Sell me. Make the child their proof of shame." His jaw tightened. "Not anymore." Behind them, the sheriff's son groaned, still alive, clutching his wound. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You're both dead the moment you ride into town." The gunslinger turned, eyes cold and steady. "Then I won't ride into town." He raised the revolver, but Lynn's hand caught his wrist. "No," she said. "Enough killing." For a long moment, neither moved. The rain hissed on the fire, smoke curling around them. Then he lowered the gun. "All right," he murmured. "No more." He left the man bleeding in the mud and lifted Lynn onto the horse. She leaned against him, half-conscious, whispering something soft in her language. They rode through the storm, following the riverbed until the sky began to pale. The rain eased, leaving behind a world washed clean, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred. By the time dawn broke, they reached the old trading post near the edge of the valley. The place had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging, its sign hanging crooked. He carried her inside, laid her on a cot, and started a small fire with the last of his matches. Steam rose from her clothes as she shivered beneath the blanket. He checked her wound, a shallow cut on her arm, nothing fatal. The child was safe. Relief hit him like a hammer. "Rest," he said softly. She reached for his hand, fingers cold and small. "You'll leave again, won't you?" He looked into the flames. "I always do. But you don't have to." Her words cut deeper than any bullet. He had spent years convincing himself that he was beyond redemption, a man built for violence, undeserving of peace. Yet here she was, offering him a place in a world he didn't think existed anymore. He turned to her. "I've buried too many good things, Lynn. You and the child. You're the last ones I want to lose." "Then stay," she whispered. Live, not just survive. He wanted to say yes. But he knew the sheriff's men would come eventually. The boy wouldn't forget his humiliation. Staying would mean dragging her into another fight. So he stood, watching the light grow stronger outside. "When the sun's up, I'll ride north," he said. "They'll follow me instead." Tears filled her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "And if they kill you? Then they'll be done looking for you." He walked to the door, the revolver heavy in his belt, his coat still damp from the storm. Behind him, her voice cracked through the quiet. "I'll name the child after you," she said. He paused, back still turned. "Don't," he said, almost gently. Give him a name that belongs to the living. The sun climbed slow, gold spilling across the valley. He mounted his horse and looked back one last time. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in his coat, her hair catching the first light. For the first time in years, he saw something that made him believe the world might still have a reason to keep turning. He tipped his hat to her and rode away. The wind caught his coat, the horizon stretching endless ahead. He didn't know where the trail would end, only that it would end on his own terms. By noon, riders appeared behind him. The sheriff's son among them, arm bandaged, face twisted in hate. The gunslinger didn't run. He led them into the Badlands, where rocks rose like tombstones and the sky pressed low and red. Gunfire cracked through the dust. He rode hard, returning fire only when he had to, each shot deliberate, merciless. The chase lasted hours until both sides were bleeding and spent. When the last bullet left his gun, silence fell again. Smoke drifted across the ridge, carrying the smell of gunpowder and rain-soaked earth. The sheriff's son lay motionless. The others were gone or scattered. The gunslinger sat his horse a long while, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd survived again, but survival no longer felt like victory. He turned north toward the empty mountains where no one knew his name. Back at the trading post, Lynn watched the smoke rise in the distance, her hands resting on her belly. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered a prayer, not for his soul but for his peace. The world outside was quiet again, and in that quiet, the child inside her kicked once, gentle and sure, somewhere beyond the ridge. The gunslinger rode into the fading light, the sky behind him painted with fire. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. For the first time in his life, he'd left something good behind, and that was enough. The storm had ended, and though the land would remember the blood, it would also remember the man who chose to lay down his gun.